Hello everyone, I'm Jonathan, also known as the Medieval Genie, and for today's topic we're going to be talking about sword fighting exercises that you can do during lockdown. Just stuff that you can do solo that doesn't need to worry about things like areas and events you can't attend, the social distancing and all those things. You're alone, you've got some sort of suitable training item, and you want to practice getting a bit better, or at least stopping yourself from being rusty in sword fighting, while not needing any kind of opponent or partner, or even anything like a test cutting stand, because I know some people have things like apartments, flats and such areas where they cannot just go outside, have a sharp sword, get a plastic bottle or tatami mat and do all of those exercises. And especially that sort of thing can get expensive if you were doing that a lot as well. I can imagine all of that debris from dozens of tatami mats. It wouldn't be so fun to clean up either. So, for a moment, I'm going to switch because I've got a sword here that I made which is sharp, but you don't have to have one of these. This is just to show that I do use sharp swords. I don't want to look like a child playing with toys, but we are actually going to temporarily switch to a toy. So this is a wooden sword that I got a very long time ago. It was before I even had a beard, so many years ago. But you can still do all of the same exercises that I'm going to talk about today with this. So if you don't have a real sword, bearing in mind you're on your own, so as much as I'm going to personally switch to a real sword because the internet is a shit place and people are going to laugh at me if I keep using that wooden toy, when you're on your own and no one's looking, it doesn't matter. You just need some sort of suitable object to do practice with. So, when it comes to practicing, I'll borrow from British Military Sabre what is called the numbered cuts system. Now, I say this is from Military Sabre, so we'd be talking closer to the Napoleonic era. However, this sort of system can work perfectly fine with any type of sword. You can be doing Oriental rather than European sword fighting. You could be looking at earlier, such as medieval, or migration era or Roman era types of weapons. The numbered cut system is just a methodology to make it simple for you all. Not to say that you are simple, just that it's really handy to condense it, because if we get too airy-fairy of all these fluffy sort of techniques and things, it can get too complicated and then you might remember some bits and forget others. If you have something boiled down, like a numbered cut system, it's a nice handy way to remember all of it without having to strain yourself with, manuscripts and many pages worth of stuff. So, let's start with the numbered cut system. So, bearing in mind, you're perfectly free if you are, say, left-handed to swap around, or if you're using two hands, you can adapt. So, we will start, let's say, with cut 1. So when I say cut, an odd numbered cut, for the most part I'm going to be talking about cutting from your dominant side. Now I, using a sword, am right-handed, so I'll be cutting from my right. But if it's more preferable for a left-handed person to cut from their left side, I don't mind, it doesn't matter. You just need to bear in mind using both sides, which I'll get into in a minute. So, for cut 1, whether you're doing it one-handed or two-handed, what you're doing is a simple downward diagonal cut from your dominant side. If you're imagining an opponent who is going to be cut, you would be probably going from somewhere like their cheek or their shoulder or their neck in between, down to maybe somewhere like the kidney or waist sort of area. So I'd be just cutting like this. I'm just doing a simple downward cut diagonally, in my case from my right, because that's my dominant side. And then, of course, with cut 2, we will be doing the same thing from the non-dominant side. So, I'm going from here, cutting from my left, even I'm right-handed, doing a cut. Now, remember, it's very important that you do include the non-dominant side, because if you're doing say a bit of test cutting against a target that doesn't move or resist or desire not to die in any sense, it's easy that yes, you will do more damage, to put it into video game terms. You'll cause more injury, more of a physical attack to the target. If you cut from your dominant side, I am right-handed using a sword, so I am stronger doing a cut from my right. But it's very important as a good sword fighter that you do not only attack from your dominant side, which is why these even-numbered cuts are going to be from your non-dominant side. Let's say someone is putting up some sort of defense, so if you're attacking, let's say I'm attacking from my right in any fashion, they are getting used to the fact that I attack only from this side. They're going to get used to just putting up the relevant defense, so all of this is just going to get covered. So instead of halving the number of angles and options you've got, always make sure in your sword fighting exercises to include the non-dominant side as well. That's just a quick side note. So very simple stuff, cutting downwards diagonally from your non-dominant side. And then cut 3 is from your dominant side, and then we'll be cutting, I'm just watching the radiator because it's winter, we'll be cutting upwards. So this would be kind of like the opposite of the downward cut, starting from maybe the waist going up towards somewhere like the cheek. That's the basic form, although bearing in mind when I say this, the types of cuts you're doing, you can aim at any part of the body. So if we went back to, or we carry on with cut 3 for a minute, I could actually aim at someone's neck or chin when I'm doing this. So here I'm doing the cut, or I can be doing more powerful cut. I'll be aiming higher, maybe I'm aiming somewhere lower, but I'm doing the same type of action, maybe more in the middle, or maybe further out like at their hands, and going backwards as I do it instead of forwards or staying still. All of this sort of stuff is worth practicing too. Now cut 4, as you can imagine, will be the same type of cut from your non-dominant side. So, same sort of thing. Now, this sword I have here is a Langsax that I forged myself. It only has one edge, but you should bear in mind if you're using a sword, any sword, that has 2 edges, instead of cutting with the front edge, so notice my knuckles are pointing forward and I'm cutting like that. This is a way in which you can cut in that cut 4. However, you can also, if you have a double-edged sword, cut using the back edge. Of course, on this sword I have here, it'll be just hitting with the spine, but if you imagine, perhaps I have switched to this one, which is double-edged. So I cut like that, and not only does it mean that I can use both edges on a double-edged sword, it also can change the way in which you fight a bit. So if someone was trying to parry against your cut going up, they might parry you if you're doing this. So notice the way my hand and my sword is positioned. There is only so far I can try to straighten the sword before I'm kind of injuring my wrist. Realistically, I'm about here and I'm comfortable. Trying to go further and straighten it, I'm going to hurt myself and I'm going to cause some kind of tendon injury. So really, if I'm cutting upwards, it's like this. Notice the diagonal angle. If I use the back edge, however, it's more like this. So you'll see that the blade is coming above the hand. So while someone might be trying to parry on this bit, you'll see that the blade is pointing down and away. So this might mean I might not hit the opponent if they were parrying me. However, if I use the back edge, since the blade is rising above that point, if I was coming from below and they've got a low defense, I might still get some sort of cut or thrust into them from behind their guard. That's just a little point to bear in mind when you're fighting, which is one of the reasons why double edges have great tactical advantages. But whether you're cutting with the front edge or you're cutting with the back edge, that's the same sort of thing to practice. Cut 5 will be a horizontal cut, a very direct horizontal cut. Now again, you can be targeting high, you can be targeting the middle, or somewhere low. If you're going to aim low, try not to do too much. I mean, I have already been told from other videos that yes, there are certain manuscripts and things like the Capo Ferro, Rapier and all of that where you can actually lean with your torso to add extra reach. But if you're a beginner, I'd recommend starting with yourself upright and know when to lean forward with your torso so you don't expose your head to attack. So if you're going to lean forward, let's say for a cut, doing this sort of same cut 5 at the legs, instead of doing this, try it more with your legs and do that. So it's a bit off camera, but I'm just stepping forward with what is just simply called a lunge. I don't care what you like to call it, just a step, and keep yourself upright and then go forwards. Because yes, you expose your legs as a target, but I don't know about you, but if I was up against a live opponent, I'd rather they cut me in my shin than in my face, you know? So that would be with your cut 5, whether you're aiming low, medium or high, and then the cut 6 is just simply doing the same thing from the opposite side. So if I'm going high, medium or low, excuse me, it's the same type of action and the same number of cut. Then we're not looking at left or right side anymore. Something like a 7 directly down, and an 8 directly up, if you should so wish. And again, with a cut 8, you can still use the back edge if you like to. And I have seen people try that against me, and it worked a couple of times until I got used to it. Just like any technique, really. If you do it too much against someone, they get wise to it and counter you. But yes, that same sort of back edge cut can work with an 8. In fact, can also work if you're going for the dominant side as well. But that's a side note. And for our 9th, but I'm not going to call it a cut, you just have some kind of thrust. Again, you can be aiming higher, lower, other things like that. Now, when I'm talking about the cuts, I have not explained about cutting from the body versus things like the elbows or wrist. So I'll quickly go into that. So when you're doing these cuts, yes, you can do all sorts of attacks. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, all of that. But notice that what I've done there is I'm using a lot more of my body. This is fine, it can work, but it does limit your repertoire if you only do that. Same as if you're only using your dominant side instead of your non-dominant side. So, if I'm wishing to cut through a target, of course, especially if it's test cutting or something where there's no resistance, if I'm cutting you with my whole body, it's more powerful. I'm going to have more of an impact, I'm going to get more of a deep cut and injury caused to the target. But that doesn't necessarily mean it's a good idea. So, with a full body cut, I am using my wrist, I'm using my elbows and my shoulders. I've got that kind of punch action going on, bringing the hand forward and then rotating my wrist. So I've got this sort of thing going on. Notice there's already a bit of power in that cut. I bring my torso across. So notice here, I start off with my left facing forward because I'm starting on my right. And then I bring my shoulders and my waist, my sort of hips across. And that just adds a little bit of that rotation into the cut. Notice, even if I don't do anything in my arms, there's still a bit of movement and power. And that adds a little bit more damage and power into your attack. And then on top of that, there's also just, apologies for that device, but yes, there's a bit more power coming from just a walk. There's nothing particularly fancy in what's called a passing step. That's just simply, if I start with my left foot forward, I've got my right foot forward. It is really just like walking. There's nothing too fancy about it, but I'll mention it that adding a step rather than staying completely still, this, you know, if I'm just like this, I'm going, this has some power in it, and that's without the walk, and it's got most of the rest in there. If I add the power of the walk, there's more power in it. And also, of course, I'm closing and going further away. It's also the lunging step. So instead of I start with my left foot forward, I've now got my right foot forward. That's a passing step, as we call it. I don't care if you remember that name or not. But then there's also a lunging step. So I'll start with my right leg forward, and I bring my right leg further forward, for example. It can be either leg, it can be in any combination, but bearing in mind that if you bring your body to bear, that helps with your attack. So with those, you can instead look at something less obvious. Because if I am going like this, I'm going to attack, and then I bring my whole body to bear, so I'm stepping on my leg, I'm bringing my shoulder and my waist forward, I'm swinging across with that whole action, just visually see how much you can tell that I'm going to do that cut, which is just a cut 1. Ha! Very obvious, which can be potentially quite intimidating. You might have a great opening so no one has the chance to react, but you won't have that all the time if it was sparring, a duel, or historical combat that you're recreating or something like that. So instead, you might be doing something a bit quicker. So we'll be doing something like this. So this is a cut 1, cut 1, cut 2, 1, 2. Notice if I'm trying to go 1, 2 with a full body, it's more like with a 1, 2, more from my elbows, it's more like this. So you'll see there, it's quicker. It's not got as much power and oomph to it, but it's quicker. And that's really useful, especially in things like feints. And now, feinting is not being a Victorian person. Ooh, I'm talking about feint as in a deception, a pretend. Now, pretending an attack is not the only way to deceive your opponent, so try not to narrow your mind too much on that, but I'll just be talking about attacks for today. So, pretending an attack, let's say I notice, let's say I want to hit the opponent's hand, because that's a nice easy target, especially for someone like me who practices hand carving a lot. One of my favourite things to do in sparring. So, I could be trying to attack, oh, they parry. Oh, they parry me. Oh, they get out of the way. Something's happening. It doesn't work. So, I might want to try from the non-dominant side. Nope, 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 doesn't work. What could work, though, is or maybe. So with a feint, I'm looking like, and I'm committing most of the way to something, but I actually change and I do something else. Again, this is not one of those types of martial arts things where it's really complicated and takes half a year to explain. It's very basic and it's very effective. I pretend one thing, I do the other thing. When you're doing it full body, you can still do this, but it's kind of harder when you've got more commitment to it. So with a full body, it would look more like this. I kind of have to almost pull myself, or, well, there are two ways that it could kind of go. I could commit quite far and almost have to pull myself from the momentum and then go into the next action, or I don't commit very much and then I put more of the body into the action I really want to do. So from a non-dominant side, doing a 2 to a 1, it could look like that sort of thing. But it's kind of harder, and you do require more commitment that way. Whereas doing it something quick, one of my favourite ways to get a nice sneaky hand carve in is doing it a cut I call from the wrist, so it's just this. So with this sort of action, all I have to do is just move the wrist to perform the cut that I'm performing. So with that, it's very easy to do a feint at someone and they either flinch, which is great because then they're reacting to something and not really doing, or they stop reacting, in which case I get a free hit. So either way it's really nice. So I just do this sort of thing. So this is from the wrist. 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 2 1 1 2 1 2 1 2 2 1 rather. I'm even deceiving myself. Just doing this kind of thing, and it also works with a two-handed sword. Again, the things I'm talking about work one-handed or two-handed. Just doing these sorts of things. What's going on? And then with that, you're able to use the wrist to do cuts, and again, all of the cuts and thrusts work from that. So you can commit full body to something like thrust. I can commit more from the wrist with a thrust. Of course, when you're doing a lunge or a thrust, you do need to put yourself forward more. Less so when you're just doing cuts. But you can do any number. So I can do 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8 thrust, which is less commitment. So it's less tiring, but also more deceptive and requires a quicker reaction from your opponent compared to doing it full body. You can imagine this 1 2 3 4 5 6 7 8. It's harder to react than going 1 2 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. It's also more tiring. You can hear me getting a little bit out of breath for that, but those sorts of actions, it's worth practicing full body motions and also quicker actions as well, depending on what is most tactically viable. It may well be you are doing something like a beat, in which case, let's say your opponent's here, they're putting up some kind of weak defence, trying to stave you away. People with spears like to do this especially, so just sort of put the point forward and go, oh, stay away. So then you might not want to just do tap, tap, oh, I can't get onto them, it's kind of difficult. You could instead go wham, beat their weapon aside and go in for what you really want. So that can help, but again, it may well be you have someone who's quick in their defence, so then you go, I get parried, I get parried, I get parried, it doesn't work. Here's a nice quick hit. So practice all of those things. You don't need a target, you don't even need a real sword, like I showed. A little toy like this I had ages ago will do perfectly fine. Also good for your exercise. You may find that using a real sword or something heftier is actually quite difficult. It is more strenuous than it looks, and I find from doing things like military saber, I've got unusually large forearms out of it, so a lot of, especially if you're doing those sorts of wrist actions, you may find that having bigger biceps and triceps and all the other seps and things, all of those other muscles might not serve you as well as you'd think, because a lot of it comes from bits like the hand and a forearm, and you may not be used to those particular types of actions. So practicing with something lighter so that you're used to just physically doing the movement is better. I find if people try to start with things that they're more uncomfortable with and trying to do those correct actions with something that's too heavy and hefty for them, that will actually encourage you to do it wrongly. You'll kind of compensate for the heavier item by making it more awkward, and that will form bad habits. So I'd rather that you used something lighter and form the good habits and just work your way up than you try starting immediately on something too heavy and then build up those nasty habits that actually make you quite an awkward fighter. I have seen people who have muscles and real power and they're quite scary with how well they can swing, you know, with how hard, I should say, not how well, how hard they can swing, but actually they're not very good fighters. They're just, it's that whole thing kind of like in the movies, like the Oberyn versus the Mountain thing, if Oberyn didn't get stupid. I'm not going to go into spoilers, but that whole idea of going whoa and swinging very hard with something very heavy, yeah, it's frightening, but that doesn't mean you can't counter it. It's actually quite easy to counter if you see what's happening. If you know what your opponent's going to do, you can have time to prepare and stop them, you know? So yeah, that's that. I hope you enjoy your practice, and remember, the point of the whole Medieval Genie channel is that if you wish to have things, within reason of course, discussed on this channel, I'll be more than happy to do so. I'm certainly not more free and open for that kind of stuff than some of the larger channels, because I'm not really inundated, as you can imagine, with requests, so there's a much greater chance that if you have some sort of request to discuss a particular type of weapon or techniques and things, I'll be more than happy to look into them if I can, and of course if it's not something ridiculous. Or even some ridiculous things. When I say ridiculous, just don't try to go into politics or stuff like that, alright? So I hope you enjoyed this, and Happy New Year!